delighted to be with you. For our British audience, I suspect that my guest, Yvette Cooper, requires absolutely no introduction. But for the Aussies who have joined in and for others around the world, I am going to introduce her to you. She is, of course, a passionate advocate for gender equality. She's been a Labor member of the British Parliament, serving a Yorkshire community for over 20 years. She served at the most senior levels of government, holding a variety of portfolios in the area of the Treasury, Home Affairs, Works and Pensions, Housing and Health, and the list could go on. In 2015, she was a candidate for the leadership of the British Labor Party, and of course, to date, the British Labor Party has not had a female leader. Yvette, I'm delighted to be with you. We could be talking about so much out of your political career, but what we're focused on in this webinar is your book, She Speaks, The Power of Women's Words. And in it, you've brought together speeches literally over a span of 2,000 years of women speaking. You start way back when with Boudica, with Queen Elizabeth, who were giving speeches to rally their troops as they went into battle. You conclude with much more contemporary figures, women who only need one word to tell us who they are, Malala and Greta, who of course are asking us to join battle for girls' education and against climate change. Now, you are a busy, busy woman. So what made you decide, you know what I want to do? I want to write a book and bring a collection of speeches together.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Julia. I really appreciate it. And to be honest, it was something that I'd thought about over many, many years. It took quite a bit of time to think about, to put together. And it was really just having been struck over many years of, as I was sometimes having to make speeches, reading speeches for inspiration, because I really enjoy reading speeches as well. And you'd occasionally pick up an anthology of speeches and discover that over 90% of the speeches included were men. And women's speeches just disappeared. So even where there were women making incredibly powerful speeches throughout history, across the world, they were just disappearing, weren't being noticed. And there was one sort of Penguin anthology that I'd sort of been struck by. I'd been flicking through and realised it was literally over 90% of the speeches were men. And actually, in fact, even now, they published an updated version this year, and still over 90% of the speeches in it are men. And it just felt that there's a whole load of women's voices that should be heard, that we should be amplifying, promoting, celebrating, debating, arguing with, disagreeing with. And it was time to pull them together. So it was very much a bit of a labour of love, really, over the years, just gathering together different speeches from all over the world and from through the centuries, including yours, your fabulous speech on misogyny and challenging misogyny as well. And delighted to have that in the book too.
Well, I felt very honoured to be in such distinguished company. There are some remarkable speeches here. And as you say, they are from all around the world. Now, once you set yourself this mission of bringing together great speeches by women, I presume you were overwhelmed with material, and then the judgment was who to include, how to curate it. How did you go about making those decisions?
It wasn't easy, and it's also in some ways quite personal as well. So some of them were just stories that had a sort of personal connection. So, for example, Josephine Butler, who was a Victorian campaigner that many people may never have heard of, but she campaigned in Pontefract in the 1871 by-election, that because she was campaigning at that time to end a very repressive prostitution law that was being used against women. And she spoke at a public meeting in my constituency, what's now my constituency, and they tried to set the barn on fire that she was speaking in. And she had to escape from this building, but it didn't deter her. She carried on campaigning. She eventually got the law changed. But I knew that story because it was a story I'd been told in the Pontefract Museum. And so that was the reason for including her speech. So some of it was very personal. Some of them were obvious speeches to include, like the Michelle Obama, "When they go low, we go high," which is a hugely powerful, very moral speech against the Trump campaign at the time during the last presidential election, and some of them were ones that I just had that personal connection with as well.
Now, we live in such a partisan political age, and given all of that, given when people look at politics, what they see, it seems, is constant fighting, I think it's worth noting that you included speeches from Margaret Thatcher and from Theresa May, even though you speak in the book about how as a very young girl you were out protesting against Margaret Thatcher's policies. And of course you were directly pitted against Theresa May in the Parliament at some points in both of your careers. Why include speeches when the content were not words you would have ever used or spoken? The ideas in them are not ones that you agree with.
So part of the point of speeches is to have argument and to debate and to persuade. And those were speeches, obviously, particularly Margaret Thatcher's speech it is effectively a setting out what Thatcherism is and what Thatcherism was. And, you know, paragraph by paragraph, I can tell you the things that I passionately disagree with in it. Have me shouting at the page. And growing up, you know, when she was making those sorts of speeches, I grew up in a family that was continually angry about the things that Margaret Thatcher's government were doing. But she was also Britain's first woman prime minister, and it's right, I think, to argue with those words, to debate them, to argue with them. The one from Theresa May is slightly different because I spent very many years arguing with Theresa May, passionate disagreements with Theresa May over all sorts of different things. This particular speech was one that I thought was brave of her to make, because that was her challenging the Conservative Party on its lack of representation, on the fact that it was perceived as the nasty party. And she got a lot of flack and vitriol and attack for doing so, but I think she was right to make that speech. So whilst I might disagree with a lot of the other things that were part of the speech, some of which I didn't include in the book, there were elements of that speech that I thought she was right to make and to give her the credit for.
And as history records, of course, much of the coverage of that speech was about what she was wearing. The leopard skin kitten heels dominated the headlines the next day, something that frequently happens to women, that what ends up being weighed is what they're wearing, how they appear, rather than what they've said. Now, I do want to take you to some quotes from various speeches that you've put in the book, because one thing that took me aback, really, I expected to read, you know, very powerful words, and obviously some of the speeches are from a long time ago. What I didn't quite expect is that some of these historic speeches would speak so powerfully to contemporary issues. One that I want to point to is by freed slave Sojourner Truth. She made this speech in 1851. And she was talking about the pressures being felt by white men in an era of change. And she used the following terms: men are in a tight place. The poor slave is on him. Women is coming on him. He is surely between a hawk and a buzzard. And I thought, in today's world where we see a global movement for Black Lives Matter, but we also see the backlash, we see Brexit, Make America Great Again, symptoms of a backlash, that those words actually speak powerfully today to a contemporary analysis of what is driving politics. How do you see that?
I think that's right, and I think she was obviously, a sort of phenomenal campaigner who toured the United States, speaking as part of the abolitionist movement, speaking against slavery and trying to persuade people in sort of church halls right across America. And was also describing both the inevitability and the power of change and the importance of change, the importance of pursuing equality, but also describing the tensions that arise behind that. And I think it's, you know, in the end, you know, equality is in all of our interests, and recognizing and respecting everybody for who they are is in all of our interests. We all of us lose out if we are pitted against each other. We all of us lose out if we don't have diverse voices, whether that be about recognising the power of the Black Lives Matter movements and protests that we've seen over the past few months, but actually going right back through history as well. The reason for having different voices is actually what makes all of us stronger and makes our communities stronger. And if we fail to recognise that, we just pull ourselves apart. And it's partly the reason I wanted to have such a different range of voices throughout the book as well, from so many different experiences and backgrounds.
And one woman who comes from a very different experience and background that you've included in the book is Benazir Bhutto, who was, of course, the first and to date only woman to lead Pakistan. She was president there. And she spoke 25 years ago at the major Beijing conference, which is famous for Hillary Clinton's speech, where she said, human rights are women's rights are human rights, which might seem like a statement of the obvious today. But when she made that statement 25 years ago, Hillary Clinton, the world went mad in reaction. You include Benazir Bhutto's speech, where she uses the following words: "The child who is starving has no human rights. The girl who is illiterate has no future. The woman who cannot plan her life, her family, plan a career is not fundamentally free." Now, we entered this COVID pandemic still with poverty in our world disproportionately on the shoulders of women, with the children locked out of education disproportionately being marginalised girls. And much of the evidence that's coming to the fore now says that the brunt of this crisis, not the immediate health crisis, because the virus actually disproportionately hits men, but the brunt of the associated economic crisis is being felt disproportionately by women. Reflecting on Benazir Bhutto's words, what do we need to do now to make sure that we do achieve her dream where, women are able to plan their lives, plan their families, have a career, be able to see a future?
Those words I think are really powerful, and you're right, they have a lot of echoes of the same similar kinds of words that Hillary Clinton was saying at the same conference. And the Benazir Bhutto, she was also talking about women's equality being part of Islam and being part of her political and faith traditions as well in that, but very powerfully talking about the impact of inequality and injustice. And I think it's interesting, I mean, the COVID crisis, the inequality has had a huge impact on health as well. So working class men and women have been more likely to be hit by health issues, and particularly we've seen the impact on Black and minority ethnic communities as well from the virus, and all of that all being linked in with the injustice. And I think I agree with you too, you can start to see now the impact on women. Men have had the brunt of the health crisis, from women now with the economic crisis, with the hospitality industry, those sorts of sectors where we have more women's jobs being more heavily hit, but also women being more affected by schools being closed and things like that, and the impact of that. But I think it also goes to have the economic injustice. If you don't tackle the economic injustice, then you don't actually see all sorts of other wider benefits flow either. And the included in the book a speech from Joan O'Connell, who in the 60s was one of the trade union speakers who campaigned for the Equal Pay Act in the UK, and Eleanor Rathbone, who many years before was campaigning for women in the home to also have an income and not be denied an income. And you see those sorts of income inequalities still being debated today, still being debated in the future. I think the challenge for us as we come out of the COVID crisis is how do you build back better? How do we address those kinds of inequalities as we come out of this crisis? How do we recognise the fact that care workers In care homes across the country, in people's homes across the country, have been some of the most important workers in this crisis, predominantly women, but also some of the least valued and lowest paid workers in the country. Those kinds of injustices have been, I think, just highlighted as part of the crisis, but they've been there for a long time. And we have a responsibility as we come out of this crisis now to address them and to tackle some of those injustices and inequalities too.
And given how long-lived a number of those gender inequalities are, when you were putting together the book and you were reflecting back on speeches that were given decades, sometimes hundreds of years ago, and they are talking about inequalities that you know are still with us in some form today, were you left at the end of it with a sense of, look how far we've come, because yes, there's still continuing inequality, but a lot of it has been addressed? Or were you left with a bit of a, sadder sense that those women fought so hard and the project of gender equality is not completed yet?
I think so many of those women achieved amazing things. So Josephine Butler, who I talked about earlier, it took her 10 years to change the law, but she did it. So sometimes the persistence and resilience has been remarkable, but you've also seen huge things change, laws change, rights change, human rights be accorded to women for the first time, or civil rights be accorded to women for the first time in different countries. Rita Malala and her campaign for girls' education now, or Greta Thunberg, who has so powerfully inspired a new generation to campaign on climate change. So you're seeing changes happen all the time. Sometimes it is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But what I think is one of the most inspiring things has been the resilience and the determination of those women to keep going, often in the face of backlash, often in the face of attempts to silence them. But they have kept going and they have done amazing things, and they show us what we can do as well.
Benazir Bhutto was assassinated, and you also include in the book a speech by Jo Cox, the dear departed Jo Cox, who lost her life out campaigning in her constituency as a British Member of Parliament. You know, that reinforces to us that women's words can be met with fury, with violence. Why do you think we live still with so much of that reaction to women who are out there in the public domain, particularly in the world of politics, trying to make a difference?
I think in some ways this has been the most sort of disturbing part, really, of putting the book together, of thinking about it and reflecting on it, because it was partly, I think, in sort of 2 ways. First of all, just looking back through some of the speeches through history, and then as I was researching people in order to be able to tell those women's stories, just discovering quite how many of them had been, had to endure violent threats, sometimes physical violence itself, and different attempts to silence them in different ways, even very different circumstances, very different countries, but still facing sort of violent threats or abuse for speaking out, for daring not to be what the expected traditional view of a woman was supposed to be, to use your voice, to use oratorical traditions that are have been for too long seen as just being about men and just being things that men are able to do, or traditionally allowed to do. And then I think secondly, I think was really just facing up to the more recent backlash as well, because I remember when we met in Australia back in, I think it was 2012, and I remember visiting you at that time, and you were doing a phenomenal job as Prime Minister, but I had been really struck, really shocked at the amount of sort of misogyny that there was, amount of sort of sexist abuse that there was online. It was the early stages of some of the Facebook groups and things at that time. And I'd sat there thinking, God, is this just an Australian thing? Because it was before a lot of the social media stuff had picked up, and it was before the attacks on Hillary Clinton, because it was before she had been standing in the same way. And then it was seeing really over the sort of following few years, just this whip round the world and back again, the scale of the way that the sort of misogyny had been given a new lease of life somehow on social media, and been able to focus on different targets and women in public life in different ways. And that, I think, is something that 10 years ago I wouldn't have imagined seeing. And that, and then of course, then we saw the other thing I would never have imagined happening was obviously to lose Jo, and to lose a friend and a colleague to a far right murder was just shocking. Just still, I think I find it hard to come to terms with the fact that that could happen. At the same time, we've also seen women come together to respond against it. We've seen a sense of social media also being used to connect people, to connect women in new movements and new ways of finding voices, and also to recognise that women have always stood up and said, we're not going to be silenced. And we've done that before, we've done that many times before, and will do so again, and are doing so again. We have more women in Parliament now than ever before, even despite the some of the stuff online that we've seen, or the threats and things that we've seen. And, you know, it does mean you need more sense of solidarity to stand against it, but it too can be overcome.
You bring out in the book not only this theme about how women can face abuse and their strength in facing it, and you actually also talk about how sexist abuse and racist abuse can come together. You talk, for example, about the experiences of Diane Abbott and include a speech from her, who Diane being, of course, the first Black woman to serve in the British Parliament. But you also bring to the fore the question of stereotyping that women hit. And you include a speech by Harriet Harman, who was at one point deputy leader of the British Labour Party and is certainly a true leader in gender equality. And she uses the following words. I found them delicious. She says, bake cookies and you are a real woman, but you can't be a leader. Fail to bake cookies and you can be a leader, but you're not a real woman. Is that stereotyping still there?
It's really interesting. I think there's still a lot of sort of stereotyping about the way in which women are supposed to behave and so on. And so if you know, if you're seen as authoritative, often, oh, well, that means you must be cold and aloof, and that somehow authority and empathy don't go together. And, you know, women are allowed to be empathetic, but they're not allowed to be authoritative. So I think that you still get a lot of that stereotyping. I think it's been quite interesting looking at the different ways that women leaders have responded in the COVID crisis. And where, you know, two of the national leaders who have been, I think, most applauded both for their leadership decisions, but also for the way in which they've communicated, have been Angela Merkel and Jacinda Ardern. They've actually got very, very different styles, very different approaches. And so Angela Merkel, when you watch her speech, her sort of televised address, it's very serious, very solid, very caring. You kind of have complete confidence in her, listening to her, very very practical and factual in her approach. Jacinda Ardern, also similar kind of sense of the practical and the factual and reassurance, but also does a much more kind of homely, chatty style of communication as well, very different from Angela Merkel's. Both of them managed to communicate authority. Both of them managed to communicate integrity. And it is, I think, challenging ways of being authoritative that are not sort of traditional male ways of being authoritative. And the things that I've seen both of them talk about, less likely to use the kind of battle language that you've seen from some of the from male leaders in the crisis in terms of how we respond to COVID-19. And so I think they've been you know, inspiring examples of ways in which you can crack the stereotypes. You know, it's not easy, but it can be done.
And you include speeches from both of them. There's Angela Merkel's speech marking the fall of the Berlin Wall, one of the anniversaries of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Of course, she was from East Germany, so she was on the other side of the wall, and that's a very compelling speech. And you include Jacinda Ardern speaking after the Christchurch massacre, where she is speaking about the sense of grief, but also the sense of healing that the nation needs, and they're both wonderful speeches. Now, people listening to us might be saying to themselves, well, that's all very well and good. There are these remarkable speeches and I'm keen to read them. But in terms of, me as an individual going out and speaking, what you're telling me is I could face abuse, I could be judged on what I'm wearing, I could be stereotyped, and the list goes on. And you include, I think, a fantastic answer to that set of fears. A woman who I must admit I wasn't familiar with, and I'm glad that your book has made me at least familiar with some of her words, a woman called Audre Lorde, who in her own words describes herself as a Black lesbian mother, warrior, poet. And in 1977, she said, "Of course I am afraid. You can hear it in my voice, because the transformation of silence into language and action is an act of self-revelation, and that always seems fraught with danger. On the cause of silence, each one of us draws her own fear, fear of contempt, of censure, or some judgment, or recognition, of challenge, of annihilation. But most of all, we fear the visibility without which we also cannot truly live. We can sit in our corners mute forever, while our sisters and ourselves are wasted, while our children are distorted and destroyed, while our earth is poisoned. We can sit in our safe corners as mute as bottles, and still we will be no less afraid." What do those words mean to you? And what would your message be to a woman who thinks that she's definitely got something to say, but is still concerned about going out to say it?
So I think Audre Lorde's speech was actually probably one of my favourites in the whole book, because it does capture that sense of vulnerability, that nervousness that you can have, and that you still get. Doesn't matter how many speeches you make, if you don't know who your audience is, or you're about to start to communicate with a lot of people, you can feel that sense of vulnerability, and that's okay. And that you can still speak in all kinds of different settings and circumstances. It's not just in politics that you make speeches, it's in so many different situations. Teachers make speeches every day to classes of children, but we don't think of those as speeches, but actually it's the same thing of going out and trying to have an impact, trying to communicate something that actually women are incredibly good at. But it's okay to feel vulnerable, I think is the sort of powerful thing that she was saying. But also that if you don't speak, then it can eat you up and it doesn't protect you. So the other words that I've sort of quoted before, she said, "My silences had not protected me, your silence will not protect you." And those words have been emblazoned on some of the banners for the Black Lives Matter protests over the last month. And I think their power still today, so nearly 50 years on, and still those words extremely powerful. And the other thing that I was struck with was actually the way she quotes her daughter in the speech as well. And her daughter said, how difficult she was finding it to write this speech and to think about how to make speeches and have the confidence to make speeches. And her daughter, and she quotes her daughter saying, she said, "My daughter said, tell them about how you're never really a whole person if you remain silent, because there's always that one little piece inside of you that wants to be spoken out. And if you keep ignoring it, it gets madder and madder and hotter and hotter. And if you don't speak it out, one day it will just up and punch you in the mouth." And so it's that sense of, you know, just get out there and say it, just get out there and speak it. It was a similar sense actually to a local activist in Castleford in my constituency, Alison Drake. It was just get up there and get at them. That was her sort of sense of spirit, of that it can feel incredibly daunting and there can be all of the challenges, but there's an awful lot of other women alongside you speaking out too. And in the end, the power of doing that vulnerability is what makes you human, but speaking out is also what you need to be human as well.
Yes. Now we're getting questions coming in from the audience on our question and answer line, and some were submitted in advance. So I'm going to take some of those. The first of them I'm going to take is from Catherine from the Royal Academy of Engineering, who asks, how do we, or how do you in particular as the author of the book, how do you view the role of white women in assisting the visibility rather than the silencing of the voices of Black women?
I think this is really important. It's made more, people are made more aware of it by the whole Black Lives Matter movement and then everything that's happened recently. But actually this has always been with us and is a challenge always to us. And I think it's partly this is about recognizing that our experiences are different, recognizing that we have to listen as well as amplify. We tried in the book to include incredibly inspiring Black women, including people like Audre Lorde, who we were just talking about, Diane Abbott, who we talked about, but also Lupita Nyong'o, Michelle Obama, Sojourner Truth, who we talked about as well, but Wangari Maathai as well, you know, women from all over the world, to actually trying to amplify voices from different backgrounds and different perspectives, and always to listen as well and recognize that in that battle for equality, all of us always have more to learn and more to be humble about and more to listen.
We're being asked from a few directions. There's Sally on the question and answer line. There's also Anna Kaiser, who put in a question in advance, and they're all effectively asking us, beyond speaking, what are our practical tips for getting out and making change? Sally says that she's 63 years old and needs a bit of rejuvenation, as we're still fighting the same battles: abortion rights, equal pay, carer support and universal childcare. Anna Kaiser says, apart from putting ourselves forward to be selected as leaders, campaigning for change and voting for candidates that better represent our needs, what can women do to break down barriers in society? What advice would you give for women who want to get out there, might feel the need for an infusion of a bit of new energy?
So I think all of those things are really powerful. I think is never underestimate the things that can make a difference. I referred to somebody called Alison Drake in my constituency, whose speech I included in the book. And she was she died last year. She was this amazing kind of local activist. And she used to speak in these meetings and everybody would quake. If she was going to disagree with you, you were finished in a local public meeting. And if she was on your side, that's it. You knew, you know, whatever it was you wanted to happen was going to be sorted out. But what she did was she managed to mobilize people, and she managed to mobilize people locally. And we've now, as a result of her work, we now have this community building, the Castleford Queen's Mill, which has been reclaimed, regenerated. And it has been at the heart of our local response to the COVID-19 crisis. And as I speak today, there are people in the mill who are filling activity packs to be delivered to young people and children across Castleford to keep people going in the crisis, delivering books, community books and so on. And that's all come from Alison's work and the local campaign that she ran. So I think it is everything from, you know, from the local campaigning that Alison's doing to Jacinda Ardern as National Prime Minister. From at every level, there are things you can do to change things. And the thing I always kind of try and encourage people to do is to encourage another woman to do something. and to suggest somebody to just apply for something, go for something, stand for something, have another go, because all the evidence shows that women are more likely to apply for a promotion or to do something if they've been asked to do so. Men are more likely to put themselves forward on their own. And that there was that book that Sheryl Sandberg wrote a few years ago that got a lot of attention, that was all called Lean In. Well, my view would be lean out and reach an arm to somebody else, and to encourage another woman from all kinds of different backgrounds to step up, to do something, to have a go.
We're getting a few questions really around men stepping up as well. From Tracy, we've got a question about how can we get men to speak about women's issues. From Natalie, we've got how do we get men to calm down and not be so hysterical? Yes, I deliberately use those words about women taking up space in the public eye. What have you used? So how can we get men to speak with women and in support of women? And how can we address the fears that we really first talked about around Sojourner Truth's speech? How can we calm those down to make more space for change?
I think men play such an important a role in terms of getting women's equality. The reason I ever sort of had the confidence to make speeches in the first place was because of my dad. My dad was a trade union official. He used to make speeches all the time. He used to talk about speeches, and he would encourage me to speak. So the encouragement of fathers to daughters, the encouragement of men to also support women to succeed is really important and powerful. But that also means challenging men for making assumptions, or for not thinking about the inequality, or about the additional hurdles that women can face with, in exactly the same way that we also should be looking at the different experiences of Black women, the different experiences of women from different backgrounds as well. And I was kind of struck as well about the recent, we were just looking at some of the response and the speeches in the UK over the last couple of months, and at a time when there haven't been public forums to make speeches. Some of the few speeches you have seen still happening have been the ministerial speeches taking place in the press conferences every single day. Of the 92 speeches, 89 of them have been made by men. So it's just shocking. 92 speeches, 89 made by men. Now, that means there's a bunch of men at the top of the government who frankly need to be challenged to move out of the way, to let there are other women speak out and to let women's voices be heard. And I would suspect that actually the lack of women's voices in some of the decision-making circles in the government during this crisis has also weakened the nature of the UK's response, and has meant they were more likely to get decisions wrong at an earlier stage by just not having a wide enough range of voices involved.
We've got a practical suggestion too on the chat line from Anita, who says that some good advice to help women's voices get heard in meetings is to agree with comments that female colleagues make, so that male colleagues are more likely to listen. So women's voices coming together. There's also a suggestion that it would be great to have an audio-visual edition of the book for the speeches that you don't have the vision. Obviously, you'd need someone to act it and voice it over, but there's an idea, an audio-visual guide. What about when you're out there as a public speaker? Everybody certainly, I know what this is like, you know what it's like. You can give a good speech, you can give a bad speech. Where do you get the confidence from to come back and do it a second time? And you tell a wonderful story in your introduction about when you misjudged your audience to the frustration of a young boy in it. Would you share that story with us and talk about fun?
It's so easy to do as well. I think the thing when you're in a job where you're having to make lots of speeches, knowing who your audience is, knowing what kind of thing they're expecting, knowing whether they're expecting you to speak, you know, for a long time or not, or what they're most interested in, is really important. And it is so easy to just get it completely wrong. And I had a speech, it was quite early on, soon after I'd been elected as an MP. And it was part of the big investment that the Labour government was putting into schools and so on at the time. And there was a school extension that had been built, and I'd been asked to open it, and I was really excited. I was going to open this new school extension. It was all really exciting. And there were lots of teachers, lots of parents, lots of the local council bigwigs and so on. Everybody was there for this thing. And then all of the children sitting in front, and I had, there was a plaque, you know, nice shiny plaque and a red curtain in front of it and so on. And there I was making this speech to this audience about using the Labour government's phrase, Tony Blair's phrase from the time, education, 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 and saying just quite how important it was and how we were doing this all across the country. And I'd been speaking for some time, and then this little kid just ran up, got up, stood up, ran up the aisle, ran past me, pulled the curtain rail, pulled the curtain cord, pulled it open. And the worst thing wasn't that he'd run, because, oh, that's quite a bit sweet. But it was the fact that the audience then all applauded in huge relief. And so it was the audience saying, we've had enough. We're on his side. We're on the kids' side. Please just get her off the stage.
And how did you feel when you went out to give the next speech? You scanned the audience, small boys likely to...
Really, really short speech. I made a really, really short speech at the next event I went to.
I can understand that. No, I've had speeches go wrong too. I do recall one occasion, Parliament House, when I was Prime Minister, it was to the local government association. So it was a very carefully crafted speech about a series of messages that as the federal government, we wanted to give Australian local government, attended by local government leaders from around the country. And my speech had been placed on the lectern for me. And the person introducing me had been told, make sure you leave the speech there. Then the Prime Minister can walk up with her hands free and start giving the speech. But of course, the person who introduced me accidentally took the speech when they left with their notes. And so effectively from memory, I had to give this 40-minute speech, not anywhere near as carefully calibrated as the written version. Had I had that there, I reckon I earned my money that day. That wasn't easy. It definitely wasn't easy.
But that's an interesting thing. So do you think, I mean, the different kinds of speeches that you give when you have a text and when you're speaking from the heart, I mean, your incredibly powerful misogyny speech, which, you know, it was kind of renowned across the world, you didn't give from a written text. You spoke, and in some ways that's been a really powerful speech. In some ways it's also meant people haven't focused on all of the phenomenal reforms you did to education or to, you know, for young people, climate change, all of those sorts of things as well. But it was also kind of a really interesting example of actually the speaking from the heart. Sometimes when you know what you want to say, you can communicate more effectively directly rather than, you know, the precisely honed text.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Now I've always preferred to give speeches not off the cuff in the sense that they not at all prepared, but speeches where you'd, you know, been thinking about things for a while. You might have some dot points to guide you, but you don't read it. You're giving it sort of in the moment. Though when, of course, as you would know, you're at the upper echelons of politics because you need to, you know, give speeches with the precise text out to the media often in advance, you end up effectively trapped into reading speeches. And I think that, for me, that's far harder to get emphasis and rhythm and engagement around a speech that you're reading rather than one that you're just giving. Now, we've got a question on the chat line, actually from a friend of mine, Cassandra, who's joining us from New York. So welcome, Cassandra. Yvette, you spoke to the British people at a critical time during the Syrian refugee crisis, where, you know, we all remember the shocking footage of children dying at sea, drowning at sea, of adults and children suffocating in vans that were shipping them as if they were, you know, goods rather than human beings across Europe. And you picked that as a moment to speak to the nation about compassion and the British tradition of taking in people in need. I'd like you to talk a little bit about that speech, but also to answer Cassandra's question, who's effectively asking, what's the next speech, the future speech you want to hear? It doesn't necessarily even have to be your speech, but if you could, you know, craft either yourself or someone else giving a message to the world, what's that message that you think we need now?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. The speech that you referred to was it was at the sort of tail end of the Labour leadership contest, and at that point we were expecting Jeremy Corbyn to be elected as the leader, but we still, in that campaign, we still had a platform. You know, as candidates, we were still getting a lot of sort of media attention, and it was at the time when the refugee crisis, the Syrian crisis particularly, had been escalating and escalating, and we were seeing people drowning in the Mediterranean, and desperate families fleeing, and a sense that the governments across Europe weren't responding to the scale of the challenge. You know, people were just a bit rabbit in headlights and responding. And I having done quite a bit of work on the refugee crisis previously, I suddenly just saw the story. There was a story in the news of a van that had been found, a lorry that had been found on the side of a road in Austria, and in it people had died, and it had been abandoned on the side of the road. And it was such an awful image, such an awful thing to happen, that I just had that sudden feeling of, I have to use the remaining time I've got on that platform to say something, and to try and jolt people into doing something, to try and jolt the government into doing something, and to also to try and describe what we needed to do, and for Britain to do our bit, and to take refugees and to welcome refugees as being part of a historic British tradition, something that we had always done in the past and we could do again, and something that we should feel a sense of both history and responsibility for the future to do so. And it was also at a time, there were other things happening at the time, and soon after, the David Cameron's government did agree that we would set up a programme for 20,000 Syrian refugees, most of whom have now come to this country, which was a big change in policy for the government at the time. But I think it's so I suppose there's sort of two different kinds of speeches that you can think of. There's the things that happen, they are just a response to a moment and a response to something that has happened right now. And then there's the speeches that are the sort of long-term building things about the future. I suppose the kinds of speeches I feel I desperately want to hear right now are the sort of unifying speech that is also positive and optimistic about the future, and that finds a way to pull people together, because right now it feels like we are falling apart and we are feeling very divided. It feels very fractious, and I think there is a way to pull people together that's not about just soggy words and lowest common denominator, that can still be radical and can be inspiring for the future, and the kinds of ways we need to change, the injustices we need to fight, the inequalities that we need to challenge. That can also be a unifying one, rather than one that just leaves us further and further apart at the end of it. And I think there are ways that the most powerful speakers manage to both challenge people to say things that audiences don't really want to hear, and to persuade them, but to still pull people together by the end of that. And that's something kind of urgently feels that we need right now.
And I think in this book, the Michelle Obama speech for that moment very much captures what you're talking about, the speech you gave in support of Hillary Clinton in that very hyper-partisan 2016 campaign, where she beautifully talked about living in a house built by slaves and now watching her daughters play on the White House lawn with their dog. A wonderful sort of bridge of continuity about how much is possible, how much change is possible from slavery to the first African-American president and family living in the White House. So that tells us that it is possible to do those top notes and to inspire. Unfortunately, though, Hillary didn't win that campaign, so more to do on bringing people together. On the chat line, we've also got Catherine. So Cassandra's been inviting us to look forward. Catherine's asking us to look forward in a different way. She's asking us to look at curriculum in schools and current education, and whether students are learning enough about Black curriculum, about the history of the different histories that so often have been excluded from our teaching, and whether they're learning about the incredible women included in this book. What would you say to Catherine?
I think Catherine's absolutely right on this, and you know, there's. I think the curriculum really sort of got narrower in that respect in some of the changes that Michael Gove made as well, and I think it is a problem because it means that there's a sort of a real lack of understanding of some of the British colonial history, for example. There's a real lack of understanding of different parts of our history and different things that make us who we are now. And we saw, and I think that's we saw that in the what happened with the Windrush scandal, and some of the work that I've been involved in Parliament has been about how we respond to the Windrush scandal and try to put right some of those injustices. But the really powerful report that came out from Wendy Williams into why that had gone so catastrophically wrong in the Home Office was also about highlighting how many people working in the Home Office on immigration things did not even understand Britain's history of immigration, so did not understand the history of the Windrush generation, of the different Caribbean migration into Britain, but also from other parts of the world as well, and that then fed into a lack of understanding about race, lack of understanding about the impact of different policies by race as well. So I think those things that feed right through from understanding your history to also the way in which policies and decisions made today is really, really powerful. So should we be thinking much more widely about the ways children learn, the voices that children learn from and hearing from that much wider range? Definitely.
Time is growing short, but on looking forward, I do want to emphasise the Global Institute for Women's Leadership is researching into gender and the current crisis, the pandemic, but with a view to looking forward and what the opportunities are to build back better, to use your phrase, and to make sure that some of the things that we're learning in this crisis about the value of women's work, of caring professions, some of the things we're learning about virtual work and the potential for better intermingling work and family life are actually built on and taken with us. So much to do. But I am going to give the final question to Juliette, who has asked, as a mother and professional, I aim to develop my daughter's voice. Do you have some suggestions on what can be achieved in the home for our daughters and what I can do as a mother to raise a daughter who feels able to use her voice more? Something tells me you've probably thought about that very deeply.
So I have two daughters and a son, and I am, as I said, I think really conscious of my experience growing up, where I think it was my dad's encouragement of me to speak was really important, as well as my mum's encouragement to speak out. I think giving our young people the confidence that we are interested in what they say and what they think, and that they can speak out, they can learn from things, and also things can go wrong, as you and I have both recognized. Things can go wrong and you can still bounce back from them, and it is okay for things to go wrong. And sometimes I think for girls, and the way that girls can be socialized very often, understand that it's okay to make mistakes and bounce back from them can also be one of the most important things to encourage young girls to learn and to have the confidence about. And also encouraging all of us to sometimes refrain from judgment, and from the way in which we can all sometimes be a little too sharp judging each other rather than giving each other the space. And I suppose then the final thought I would have as well is that, as well as building the confidence of our daughters for them to be amazing feminists in the future, we also want our sons to be great feminists in the future too. And the more that we can do that, as we encourage the next generation, the better.
And do you think it's a little harder for this generation or a little easier? They've got the benefits of more role modelling, but they've certainly got the pressures that come with social media. When you and I were first cutting our teeth speaking, if we made a bad one, maybe 50 people in the hall or 100 people in the hall went, it wasn't a great speech. Now, of course, there's a risk that it's all around the world 5 minutes later.
Yeah, I think that's much harder. I think it also feels things are much more complicated for them as well, and the sophistication that they develop growing up surrounded by the social media, this swirling mix of different things, and things moving so fast, so much faster than they ever would for us growing up too, I think does make it harder. And I do worry about some of the sort of the impact of misogyny online, the impact of different forms of prejudice and different kinds of memes and things online, and the impact that has, and the risk as well that the pace at which sometimes things can be judged online and the backlash from things online can make it harder to speak out. That to go back to the Audre Lorde words about the being worried about every time you speak, every time you say something, that you make yourself vulnerable because other people might judge you. That is sort of on steroids in social media. Even just a short tweet, or even just something that you say, that can then end up feeling like it's exposed and it's vulnerable, and it's harder then to make mistakes. And it probably means we have to be sensitive to that and do more to build young people's resilience against that, and against the sort of fleeting social medias that each day becomes, it's the new fish and chip paper, only the fish and chip paper got chucked in the bin, and this is still there. And building the resilience to stand up against that probably becomes even more important.
Well, there are certainly lots of lessons in resilience in this book. So let me recommend to everybody who's online, if you haven't read Yvette's book, She Speaks, The Power of Women's Words, let me recommend it to you. I certainly found it inspirational. Thank you for putting it together, and thank you so much for what has been an incredibly enjoyable conversation. And to everybody who's taken the time to log in and to watch the conversation, thank you for being with us, and we look forward to continuing the contact with you by the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. Thank you to my colleagues there for putting the event together. Thanks, Yvette.
Thank you so much, Julia. Really enjoyed it.
Great. Thanks.